Hello, good morning. It's a pleasure for the University of Vigo receiving today to Professor Gary Libecap. The project of Campus de Mar is starting today a new stage in the relationships between the studies of fisheries and our Department of Economics at this faculty. Gary Libecap is a professor of economics at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institutions at Stanford University. He has been the president of the Economic History Association, the Western Economics Association International, and the International Society for New Institutional Economics. The book by Gary, entitled Contracting for Property Rights, is a seminal work in the recent history of institutional analysis. And he has published a lot of papers in the top journals, such as American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Law and Economics, the Journal of Law and Economics and Organizations, the Marine Resource Economics, and a lot of different and several journals. Well, it's a pleasure for us to receive Gary Libecap as the first time, I hope that not the last one, at the University of Vigo, and he will speak about efficiency advantages of grandfathering in rights-based fisheries management. Thank you very much, Gary, for coming to the University of Vigo today.
Well, it was my pleasure to be here. It's my pleasure to be in sunshine. This year I'm at Cambridge, and the last time we had sunshine in Britain was last October. So it's wonderful to be here. I understand now why so many British people come to Spain, although it's wonderful to be here. It's also nice to be here because my co-author, Ragnar Arneson, is here, and so he will answer all the hard questions that you hear. So what I'd like to do is to give you just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I will give you then an outline and then sort of quickly move through some of the issues. And so essentially in the paper, we talk about a general movement towards rights-based management, and not only in fisheries, but across a variety of resources: water, forests, pasture lands, and of course, to some degree, the atmosphere. And the importance of rights-based arrangements is that they better capture incentives than do more centralized prescriptive regulation. They also reveal better, because if these are traded, they reveal prices which give us some sense of the value of the resource, the opportunity costs involved. And importantly, as we will show, by having, in a sense, owners, you have a better idea of who you have to bargain with, because in all of these resource settings, we have to put constraints on behavior. It wouldn't be an economic or biological problem if there wasn't overfishing or overpollution or overextraction or overharvest. In any way, there is some non-optimal behavior in the aggregate that we're trying to constrain. By having owners with incentives, we have a more efficient and effective approach to address this problem. And so we'll talk a little bit about this. We'll point out that grandfathering, which is basically recognizing past use as in the allocation process, is by far the most common in fisheries, and is by far the most common in all resources. The basic argument that we make in the paper is, and surprisingly is not addressed, at least as far as we're aware of, is that grandfathering is efficient because it increases dynamic efficiency. Property rights are always problematical because they have important distributional implications. Owners oftentimes have greater wealth, have greater political influence. And for many people, this has important social and distributional, raises important distributional concerns. And so as a consequence, they're controversial. Why we like grandfathering is not because we, certainly me, have anything at stake here. It's purely for neutral, scientific, in a sense, reasons. First off, there are a number of reasons why there ought to be some advantages to granting rights to existing users. One of them is that incumbents have innate abilities. They've been using the resource, in this case fisheries, for some time. There is specific learning that they have that is generated through learning by doing. If we allocate the asset to another party and then we subsequently have to retrade, then there's some transactions costs involved. And so by allocating initially to the first owner or the first user, we avoid those transactions costs. Incumbents have these productive advantages that are often linked to innate abilities or past learning that are not easily valued in the market, and so hence they're not easily transferable. And what that means is that someone who gets the rights, let's say we auction them off to some rich party, some party with more wealth, it's not easy to transfer these resource-specific historical skills in a market. They're hard to value. And so it isn't obvious that we will get the most efficient allocation of resources if we initially allocate the resource, in this case fishery, use rights to somebody else. They're not necessarily going to be able to acquire those past individual-specific, fishery-specific skills. More specifically, and in the model that the formal model that Ragnar's developed in the paper, maintaining rents lowers the cost of capital. It reduces, as we'll see, firm-specific risk. By recognizing past investments in the fishery, it encourages future investments because it shows we recognize property rights. And so it gives incentives for this dynamic process, investing in the stock or in the resource. As a consequence, we get the kinds of productive investments that we need. And fisheries are extremely important. They generate about 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's protein, and for many places, they're a very important source of wealth. So in the paper that's available to you, we provide a narrative that sort of outlines why we believe it's efficient to assign rights to incumbents, and not just for political reasons, which is often the argument made. We have a model that sort of outlines the argument more formally in stressing the importance of capital costs and investment. And then we provide some supportive evidence. But the evidence is not the evidence we would want. That is, we don't test. But it is supportive evidence, and then at the end of the paper, and I'll describe that to you, at the end of the paper, we call for more research. So that's the overview of the paper. What I'll do very briefly is to just talk a little bit about the movement towards rights-based management, briefly mention the various ways in which, if you're going to have rights-based management, then we have to decide, well, who then is going to get the rights, and there are a variety of ways to do that. I'll briefly talk about resource rents and how they can be increased by recognizing incumbents, and then describe some of the empirical evidence that we have. So the movement towards rights-based management, wildlife and fisheries are is a poster child for an open access resource. The problems have been understood for a very long time by fishers for a very long time, but certainly among economists since the classic articles by Scott Gordon, Tony Scott, and others. And then there have been a host of articles recently in Science, magazine about fisheries and, different rights arrangements that seem to protect them better than prescriptive regulation. Nevertheless, historically, the initial response to overfishing has been to control access. This is attractive politically because you can deny non-citizens or others rights to the fishery, and this seems to solve the open access problem. Nevertheless, among recognized fishers, we still have to constrain behavior in some manner, and so we have a variety of input and output controls. And Rogenvaldur-Hanneson's book that I mentioned up here, reference up here, nicely describes this process in his book, The Privatization of the Oceans, of how this movement from regulation towards rights-based management has taken place. Unfortunately, this is just not a very happy empirical record. There aren't many fisheries that have rebounded well. Most regulation turns out to be very costly and not effective. And it's not just in fisheries. If you look at air pollution regulation in the United States for SO2, acid rain, the initial arrangements were regulation, standard rules across emitting firms, extremely costly and extremely ineffective. And they were replaced finally by the 1990s, after about 20 years of costly regulation, with a rights-based cap and trade system. So the movement in fisheries is towards a property rights system. It's not ownership of the stock, but rather, because it's too costly to define, but an ownership of the flow. And so it turns out to be a share of the total annual catch, which is determined in some manner. There are a variety of these: individual transferable quotas, individual vessel quotas, and so forth. They also vary in terms of the nature of the property right. Some are more secure, others less so. Those in Iceland and New Zealand tend to be more secure. Those in the US and Canada tend to be less so. And there is some work underway to actually try to measure the effects of differential property regimes on the value of ITQs. The importance of them in terms of incentives is that the value of the fishing right, or the share, depends on the stock. If the stock is depleted, then the value of the share is reduced. And so it changes the dynamic so that fishers have greater incentive to protect the stock and invest in the stock than they otherwise would under regulation that restricts vessel size or timing of fishing and so forth. In the latter setting, it's really the individual fisher against the state or the regulator. Under an individual transferable quota or rights-based system, it's the individual fisher acting in his or her own self-interest in a manner that in the aggregate is beneficial. And so that's their value. Also, it's important, if they're tradable, then we can trade these assets across individuals and across time, so we get them allocated in a more efficient way. And as I mentioned before, with owners, we know who to deal with. In an open access setting, we don't, because any party can enter and disrupt any kind of arrangement. And so as a consequence, a property regime turns out to be quite important, or very important, for efficiency reasons. Ragnar here has laid out the conditions, the types of property right, the characteristics of a property right that give it the most value, and these are standard, understandable. The more permanent, the more valuable. The more secure, the more valuable. The more exclusive, the more valuable. The more tradable, the more valuable. Any of those margins that are restricted, we reduce the value of the right, and therefore its contribution towards better management of the stock. There are immediate gains in rents just from restricting entry, because we then immediately solve the over-access problem. But we can also go beyond that, and that's what we're really interested in terms of dynamic efficiency here. We can encourage fishers to invest in the stock and in other manners that actually increase rents. So this can be investing in fishing practices that have less impact on juvenile fish and areas in which spawning takes place. New practices that are cost efficient but also protective. We can invest in search for new fisheries with anticipation that we will then have ownership of them in some sense. We can coordinate across other fishers that have rights to have more efficient management. And as a consequence, ITQs, by and large, although they're controversial, as I mentioned, by and large, the evidence is quite strong that they have beneficial effects empirically. And so here's some of the papers that I've gathered from the literature. I've already mentioned that it's important in the rights-based management to have investment that takes advantage of innate learning by doing, so you know where the stock can be invested in a manner, in a way that increases resource rents, that is really fishery specific. It's important to know that grandfathering, particularly if these rights are tradable, doesn't preclude entry by others, okay? But, because they can buy out the fishers that get these rights. But it emphasizes the importance of localized knowledge and idiosyncratic skills that are otherwise not easily valued in the market. And we argue that incumbents have a comparative advantage relative to others in terms of advancing fishery rents. In terms of allocation mechanisms, I won't take time, but basically we can have equal draws, so any of us could have an equal chance of getting a fishery right. And then if you're like me with no fishing skills, I would want to sell it right away, and so as a consequence, there would be some transactions costs, but nevertheless, these are attractive to many because they have their distributional consequences. So they might be useful for new fisheries. Auctions are loved by economists because they reveal highest valued use, and they also generate rents. They generate resources for the auctioneer. And oftentimes, this is the state, and so it's seen as a way of providing resources for otherwise beneficial uses. This is particularly popular right now in terms of the literature on allocating cap and trade for greenhouse gases. And the key efficiency advantage that's emphasized there is that the resources that are generated through an auction could then be used to reduce distortive income taxes. And so that's the key advantage, although there's no particular reason why a politician would do that, but that goes beyond that literature. Political allocation is not done much in fisheries. It's done a lot in other resources, particularly mineral resources. All property rights are political, but this means ones where essentially politicians give resources to their cronies, people, insiders. First possession is grandfathering. That is, we give the rights to those who were there first. This is by far the most common practice, not only in fisheries, but virtually all resources. It's simple, and why we like it from an efficiency point of view is it rewards search, and it rewards innovation. It's controversial because non-incumbents are often excluded. So in the paper, we describe a variety of rents that are associated. The rent literature in economics is especially vague with imprecisely defined terms. So let me give you two pictures that I've taken from Ragnar in a presentation of his. But essentially, the yellow rectangle there are the resource rents that we normally think of, in situ rents, that are associated with a resource that is fixed in supply. And then the blue triangle there represents rents associated to inframarginal or heterogeneous factors that work with that fixed resource. And so we can have that full area there can be a source of static rents, so to speak. What we're interested in, though, is not static rents, but dynamic rents. And we're showing this here by shifting out in this value of the marginal product curve out to the right. And that doesn't happen by magic. It happens through the decisions of individuals, and individuals who have incentives to engage in this activity, and individuals who believe they'll capture at least a portion of the returns involved. And that's what we think is associated or benefited through grandfathering. And so what are some of the kinds of investments we're thinking of? Well, investments in marketing, okay? So that the product is presented to new users in new ways that are more valuable. Or investments in the stock, or investments in fishing practices, any of which can increase the value of the fishery in a way that doesn't currently exist. Okay? So the question then empirically is, does it matter which allocation mechanism we use in terms of the pattern of dynamic rent creation? And we argue that it does. If you extract rents through auctioning, for example, or some other taxation policy, you actually make existing fishers poor, okay? And as a consequence, it raises the cost of funds, because all of this activity of search and innovation is costly. And so as a consequence, they have to have funds from someplace to engage in search or to engage in innovation. And oftentimes these are in activities that are not easily described to banks or standard financial institutions. And so firms across all industries rely on retained earnings for many types of investment. And if we extract the rents, then our fishing firms are less wealthy. And so as a consequence, we have the greater chance of default risk, and therefore a higher cost of capital. A higher cost of capital means we have to equate that with the value of the marginal product of only the highest valued returned activities, and as a consequence, we have less investment. So higher cost of capital, by extracting the rents, we get less investment in the industry. Elsewhere, this is referred to, the use of internal funds those are often called retained earnings, or undistributed profits. And I'll talk to you, there has been some empirical work on that score. Also, if we tax away or auction away the right, then it signals that we are not really respecting past activities, past investments. And so that weakens property rights and weakens incentives, again, in a dynamic sense, for long-term activity. So in the model, we developed this. It really links wealth with the cost of capital and incentives to engage in investment. And this investment increases future returns in future wealth. The key advantage in the model is that incumbents have specific information, as I mentioned, on how to take current stocks and turn them into higher valued ones in the future through greater investment. And that the marginal cost of this kind of R&D falls within a company's wealth. So wealthier companies with this firm-specific information, this knowledge, are more likely to and have greater incentives to invest in the stock. And that increases wealth. So this slide here really just continues to summarize the model that this varies across firms because firms have different levels of wealth, different understandings of investment opportunities, so they have different marginal values of investment. And so, again, to repeat, auctions, by reducing the wealth of incumbents, raises the cost of capital and therefore reduces the incentive and ability to engage in productive investments. Let me move to some empirical evidence and then open it up for questions. So we can't really test this. We can't test it because auctions just aren't used very often. They're hardly ever used in fisheries, and they're hardly ever used in other resources. They're used in the US for the distribution of harvest rights or extraction rights when the federal government owns the resource, so it's not really an open access resource. But for open access resources, we just don't see auctions very often, and so as a consequence, we can't really, at least easily, test at this point. So what we've done is to look elsewhere for supportive evidence to see if it points in the direction of the predictions that come out of the model. Well, first off, we wanted to see, are fishery firms especially vulnerable to this sort of effect, this wealth effect? And they would be if they're undiversified. And so we collected some information from Ragnar in terms of Icelandic companies, and also some information that I gathered on the California wet fish industry that basically demonstrates that most fishing firms are relatively undiversified. They have relatively few vessels, and you don't get a lot of horizontal or internal or vertical integration. We also put in the paper just an anecdote on some investment that takes place that has long-term consequences with rights-based management, and this is some evidence from New Zealand where ITQs have been in place for a long time, and we've had some important long-term beneficial effects. Then I looked to some other examples outside of fisheries where there was the opportunity to auction and it was not chosen. And so here's a good example. This comes from McDonald's in a paper that I like a lot by Kaufman and LaFontaine. They're both experts in franchising. So McDonald's has a huge brand. And they could auction off the right, the franchises to franchisees, and thereby capture all the rents. But they don't do that. And in fact, they have a relatively low fee that they charge franchisees. And the argument that they use for this is they want to leave the potential rents up front to be created by the franchisee. Now, McDonald's benefits from this, it's clear. Okay, so these rents are ones that McDonald's as the broader company will benefit, but they want to provide a lot of incentives to franchisees to invest in McDonald's, okay? And a lot of this is based on local knowledge. They know communities, they know the area in a way that the central McDonald's company would not. And so they know the tastes of the people involved and so forth. And so they want to take advantage of this firm-specific investment. These are also people who are generally not wealthy. These are people who otherwise would not be able to access other forms of capital. Now, we're not making a capital markets failure argument. We're just arguing that information is costly, and information is costly to transfer, so there's higher risk associated. In the US, another empirical example, so there's just a series of really unrelated empirical examples, but to sort of demonstrate our argument. Hard rock mining in the United States was allocated, beginning in the 19th century, the rights were given away. And basically they could have been auctioned, but they were given away. And the arguments were made explicitly that this upfront, the hard rock mining is very capital intensive. We wanted to encourage investment to people who knew about the local mining conditions. And this is at least one reason why the American mining industry developed much more rapidly to be a world leader than, for example, neighboring Mexico, which also is well endowed in resources, but the property rights regime has been much less clear, and the state has extracted resource rents. And so the history of mining as well as petroleum development in Mexico is not a happy one. In terms of firm investment in relying on internal firm funds, Calamitous and Hubbard, in a Journal of Business article in 1995, again, there aren't a lot of empirical cases to test our arguments, and so in the 1930s, there was a retained profits tax put into place because the notion was that firms were too rich and that the government wasn't, and so the government would take this wealth. And so they put into place retained earnings, which were normally used to fund internal investments. They taxed those away and investment levels plummeted. And so, in fact, the effects were so dramatic, and after all, this was the 1930s, the middle of the Depression, when we needed investment, we needed dynamic activities, the law was repealed. So to conclude, there is a great deal of movement towards rights-based management across fisheries and just a variety of resources, and so this raises the question of who's going to get the right. The key contenders are auctions or grandfathering. And for many economists, they're attracted to auctions for a variety of reasons, and those that make reference to grandfathering say it's for political reasons, because fishers are influential. But in fact, they're not very influential in most economies, and there are other more efficiency-based arguments that we develop for long-term investment. We end by calling for more research. If we're going to move towards rights-based management, we have to understand the efficiency implications of the allocation rule. And we cannot be, as many economists are, fairly quick to claim that auctions are neutral, because they might not be. And that grandfathering is primarily reflective of political factors, because we argue it has long-term efficiency consequences. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.